Hello, welcome. I'm Reverend Aundreia Alexander with the National Council of Churches, and I am here representing a faith-based coalition of partners that have come together to work on reparatory justice. We're doing a series on atoning for injustice and building a future together. As you all know, right now, as we are speaking, that our nation is dealing with the issue of voting rights and voting rights as a human rights issue and accessing the vote for all. So today we're going to be talking about that very issue. Our group has come together as faith-based organizations to look at the issue of reparatory justice and its intersection with so many other issues as from a theological, biblical, faith-based lens. So I'd like to introduce you now to our, all of a sudden, our facilitator for today. God help us all. Our facilitator today is Reverend Antonia Ruth Coleman. She's the program coordinator for the very recently founded and started Center of Reparatory Justice, Transformation and Redemption, a joint organization between the McCormick Theological Center and the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, which is also a partner coalition of this faith-based grouping. Reverend Antonia Ruth has a Master's of Divinity with a particular focus on reparatory justice from the lens of womanist care for widows, stewardship of the earth, and her resources in sexology. And she will be facilitating this conversation today. Reverend Antonia, thank you so much for doing this with us.
Thank you, Reverend Alexander, my beloved sister, for introducing me and having me. I am so grateful for this opportunity. Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome to this space. Welcome and thank you for coming. We are so happy that you decided to take the time out to engage us on these various topics. Like my sister said, we are here to bridge the gap between voters' rights and reparations or reparatory justice, and with the theological lens, also with explanation of what those particular acts are, and a call to action, because the work wouldn't be the work without a call to action, correct? So let's get started. First, with our theological conversation with my dear sister, Dr. Cassandra Gould. Hello, Dr. Cassandra, and welcome. Please share with us your theological reflection for today.
Good evening, my sister and all of my sisters and my brethren. Thank you all for this opportunity. ironically, it's not ironic, it's providentially, I am in DC, in the Senate, listening to the debate, stepped out to be with the Black Caucus while they did a press conference on that. So I'm sitting in a room in the state capitol where the arbiters, at least the earthly arbiters of what they think is justice, the earthly arbiters of democracy, are literally battling it out to see who's right. What has been missed sorely in many of the arguments around policy and et cetera has been the human cost, has been the impact, not just on a current generation, but on the next generation. Again, I'm Reverend Cassandra Gould. I bring you greetings from DC by way of St. Louis. I want to share with you this afternoon just a little bit Exodus. I'm an AME preacher, so the word for me comes from the Christian Bible. In Exodus, the 11th chapter, just read the second verse. It says that the Israelite women were told by God to go to the Egyptians, to the very ones that had held them in oppression, who had enslaved them, and ask them to give you not bread, not borrow a cup of sugar. Some of us come from communities where somebody was always knocking on the door needing a cup of flour or a cup of sugar, but to give them gold, to give them silver, and to give them clothing for their sons and their daughters. This is reemphasized in Exodus 12, verses 35 and 36. The Israelites, these melanated brothers and sisters, were preparing for freedom. They knew that they were going to be leaving in the middle of the night. They knew that Harriet was coming and they would be making a way out of Egypt to get out of enslavement as a community of people. And I'm always struck by this passage because it is a reminder that it is not enough to give people freedom legislatively. It is not enough to legislate freedom. And we know that the Emancipation Proclamation, which we know the story of that, but there were still people who were enslaved who did not even know that that had been done. We must, in this moment, and the Bible reminds us that people need the tools of freedom. In this very hour, in this very moment, where people who we voted for to go and represent us in the highest office is of the land, they are debating if we actually need the tools of freedom. When the text tells us that they asked for the silver and the gold, it was reparatory in nature, because what it meant is, now after you have spent 400 years, people like us, myself, Reverend Alexandria, Reverend Antonia, we know what it means to be the descendants of people who spent more than 400 years in bondage. It meant you had nothing. It meant that the majority, those in charge, had already stripped you of every right to live an abundant life that you had. And so it was befitting, it was necessary that instead of your descendants inheriting the plunder that we have inherited in America, in the biblical narrative, they actually inherited something that they could take, not just some temporary thing that would get them through the night, not the crumbs off of the master's table, but gold and silver, so that they could actually make an investment into their progeny, into their future, so that the next generation of Israelites might not have to live with the burden of being the descendants of those who had every right, even their every human right, their very humanity stripped away from them. I believe that this is the model as people of faith. This is the model that we should be relying on, not just in this moment when we're talking about voting rights, but in moments even as we talk about what it means to be made whole after more than 400 years of being in bondage in a country that really only gave us plunder even after they allowed us to be free. The gold and the silver, again, is a deposit. One version, actually, if you look at the in the 12th chapter of Exodus, it indicates that the Egyptians were stripped of their clothing. Even I believe, when I think about it, using my Black womanist mind, I believe that the women asking for clothing for their children, for their sons and their daughters, it was an act of redressing, an act that says, I can put on my children that which you had, because my children too deserve that which you had. The clothing was a sign of your status. And in this case, it wasn't about wearing designer clothes. It wasn't about the kind of superficial status that we have come to be so enamored by in America, but it was about the status of you too being human. It was an earthly sign that you were as good as anyone else. As Black people in America, those of us who are melanated, most of us know the story of your parents. You grew up in households where our parents, our grandparents were intentional even about how we looked, because they wanted you to look like somebody's child. And the text is reminding us that all of us are somebody's child, somebody on earth. And then we also are the children of God. And so this act of redressing, of getting the clothing that the very oppressors had worn, meant that now, instead of dressing my children in something that will make them a target, instead of dressing them in something that lets them look like that they are less than, I get to dress them in something that they deserve, so that they will grow up with what Maya Angelou called, and Dr. James Cone even called, a sense of somebodyness. He talked about how in his little church, in his little AME church in Arkansas, he learned a sense of somebodyness. This reparatory justice means that we take children who've only known plunder and allow them to finally have a sense of somebodyness, being able to vote, and being able to vote in ways that are unencumbered, ways that you don't have to show special ID. You don't have to worry about having something that others don't have. You don't have to count the beans in the jar. You don't have to wait until certain days. You don't have to be denied and purged from the rolls. It is our modern day sense of somebodyness. It is what those who have oppressed us and the descendants of those who have oppressed us, it is literally what they owe us. They owe us the tools of liberation. They owe us our inheritance from them, so that we might be able to redress, to live fully in this moment, and to access the things that we need. How do we access these things? In 1957, when Dr. King gave his sermon, Give Us the Ballot, it was not just about a connection to the past, but it was also to ensure reparatory justice. It looks back at the infraction that has been done, and it repairs that and pays forward into the future, so that the descendants, those who are living in the future, that they are able to have the kind of justice that maybe even parents and grandparents didn't see. It is repairing your progeny, repairing for the next decades. And so he says, give us the ballot, right? He says, if you give us the ballot, we don't have to keep coming begging for you to legislate voting rights 57 years after John Lewis, my mother, and so many others crossed the bridge and were bloodied on Bloody Sunday. Give us the ballot, he's saying. Then we can actually decide who actually gets to be on the floor of the Senate when not just voting rights comes up, but other things come up that impact our very livelihood and our lives. Give us the ballot so that we can ensure that the people that represent us, that they represent morals and values that are centered in people and not partisanship. He was projecting into the future, understanding that the right to the ballot was an act of reparatory justice, that the right to the ballot was a redressing that would allow our children to have what the descendants of Jim and Jane Crow had always had. It was a redressing. It was like the Egyptians said, I need your clothes too. I don't just need your silver and your gold. When folk look at my kids in the marketplace, I need them not to look at them and to decide that they're going to have to count jelly beans. I need them not to look at them and to decide that they don't get to have water when they're standing in the line trying to vote. I need them not to have to get an additional form of ID. I need them to have everything that you have so that when they arrive to the promised land, they will not be 10 years, 50 years, 60 years, 75 years, continuing to actually negotiate for the crumbs of democracy. It is a way of making people whole. I believe that in this moment, certainly as people of faith, God is calling us. I believe that in this moment, it is really on the church, the church in the big C. It's on the church to actually model that. What does reparations, reparatory justice look like in the body of Christ? What does reparatory justice look like for those of us who are believers? It looks like even we're all in Zoom rooms now, so we don't see the differences in the edifices of white churches versus Black churches. But reality is there are many differences because we still have not gotten what we were supposed to get. We don't have the tools for freedom to actually engage and to live freely like God desired. In this moment, we need the 40 acres and a mule of modern times. And a part of that mule is the mule that takes us to democracy. Voting rights is the mule that takes us to democracy. Study that passage. Think about what it means, not just to cross out of Egypt, but to actually go with what you need so that you can live and be made whole and not have a need to keep going back to the Egyptians and begging for crumbs in the name of democracy. Bless you all. Thank you.
Amen. I feel like my coworker sitting next to me is pumping up his fist. In the tradition of where I attend church, it'd be time to raise an offering. Amen. Thank you so very much, Dr. Gould. I appreciate it. We hear you when you say it's not enough to just legislate freedom. And we hear you when you said that we need the tools of freedom for the people we voted. We need that modern 40 acres and the mule, and how the mule is our voice and to vote uninhibitedly, right? What was that text again in Exodus that you mentioned? I want to make sure if anybody who came on after you started, get that again, please. Exodus
was Exodus 12, 35 and 36.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And as we segue from this moment of theological reflection, we are now going to talk to Reverend Mark Thompson, who is in the same room as Reverend Cassandra, and who will connect our not just the theological reflection, because he is well capable to do so, but also connecting reparatory justice to what it means to have this moment in time for our bills, HR 40 and whatnot. Hey, Reverend Mark, how are
Hey,
you?
I'm fine. Can you all hear me?
Yes, sir. We hear you just fine. Go right ahead in the name of all names.
Well, good to see you as always, my friend, and good to see all of you here. It's a blessing to be here, as I'm sure um, Queen Cassandra said to you. We are here at the U.S. Capitol, and we are in the Capitol building where the insurrectionists were trying to get into. We literally are less than 100 feet from the entrance of the Senate, and we're in the Mike Mansfield room. I'm gonna make Dr. Gould stay in here with me so I can keep an eye on her so she don't try to do like the insurrectionists and run up in the Senate room, because I think we've heard some stuff today, it make you think about, how you want to behave up here. But we're good. We're still nonviolent preachers and in nonviolent protests. But actually today we're not even protesting. We're here to listen. We're here to learn. We just left the Congressional Black Caucus, which had a very, very brief press briefing today. And so if we're talking about reparations, first of all, let me just say, this is a Mike Mansfield room, and I deliberately chose to sit in front of this picture of this slaveholder behind me. That is the legacy of America. That is America's. You want to be theological? When we talk about original sin, there are practical applications to Scripture. And America's original sin, its fruit from the forbidden tree, was the enslavement of our people. For Western civilization, the fruit from the forbidden tree was slavery and colonization and exploitation of people all over the world, people of color. We didn't see any nations of color, any cultures of color go and conquer other countries, other people of color. This only came from Western civilization, the European Western civilization as well as American. And so when we talk about Christ, my theological belief strong is, we say this, Dr. Gould, Jesus paid our ransom. Our freedom was bought with a price. Jesus saved us and saved our whole lives. I believe that Jesus was God the Father's living reparation for the sins of the world. And so now we must continue to demand reparations for the ongoing sins of the world, the ongoing oppression that we face, and not just from the period of enslavement. What HR 40 does, this is the newer bill 2.0 that was the upgrade, so to speak, the advancement, the evolution from the John Conyers legislation. It includes vestiges of slavery or remnants of slavery. We know what a remnant is. And to be very clear, that means slavery and all of its evil offspring, be it Jim Crow, lynching, segregation, poll taxes, police violence, which is a modern day form of lynching, voter suppression. What happened after this is the second Congressional Black Caucus. There was another Black Caucus before this one, and it was real in Reconstruction. Former enslaved individuals were in that Black Caucus, and then it was all taken away right after Reconstruction when the troops were moved out. And so voting rights, what we're here today for specifically, ties into reparations. And guess what? The longer they suppress our vote, the more they suppress our vote. It just keeps the toll ticking and the cost rising in terms of what we are owed. So we are owed for enslavement and all of these things. And we are owed for ongoing voter suppression, gerrymandering, all the things we're facing, anything that does that. And so that is why we're here today. That is why we're going to continue to be here. That is why we must keep up the fight. And those of us in the clergy community, I'm here with all these clergy, and you know, people look at you different when they know you're in the clergy, and especially when you wear the collar. And we've been talking to members of Congress and senators. I don't mean to be pessimistic or discourage everyone, but we have to be truth tellers. We're here to preach the gospel. We're not going to get much done today. Manchin and Sinema are blocking this a big deal. And folks, we may have to reorient our relationship with power, because a lot of times we interpret, so we're supposed to be the prophets as a clergy. We're not supposed to let power interpret to us. We're supposed to be interpreting to the masses, to the people as clergy. So when power says, well, if y'all just vote in November 2020 and vote in Georgia in special election, we'll have a majority. But that's really not true. And that sets us back, because when that was said, it was really a dishonest thing to say to the masses. The average person doesn't understand filibuster and cloture and all of that. And this filibuster of enslavement. It is so we've got to fight against all of that. You know where the word filibuster comes from? It comes from the word filibusteros, which means insurrectionist in Spanish. The first filibusterers went into Latin American, Central American, South American countries before the Civil War and caused insurrections to overthrow those governments so they could prop up people to then agree to annex those states. All those Central American countries were going to become United States in the Confederacy, to annex more slave states into the Confederacy to win the war. That's where that vulgar term filibuster, filibusterers, filibusteros comes from. And so to hold that up, now it has been used over the years to block civil rights, to block anti-lynching laws, to block the right of women to vote. All of that has happened, and yet it is still a relic, and it is still there. So something has to be done about that. And it is our job to tell the truth. And we may have to call some of our friends in the Democratic Party out too, because they misled the people. This is never a true Democratic majority. And this is not the first time we've given our blood, sweat, and tears to vote for a party that then has not fulfilled its promises to us, and may not have ever really intended to, and may not have ever really been able to do it because of these arcane rules. And so this is part of our ongoing struggle. Voter suppression comes right down the line with all the other things we faced as a people, and we must continue the fight. God bless you all. I've got to get back to business here, but honored to be here. I want to thank Reverend Alexander for inviting me, and want to thank all of you for your vigilance. We got to keep up this fight in the name of another member of the clergy who was cut down at the young age of 39 years old, whom we just celebrated. In the name of another member of the clergy who was about to come together with him, who was cut down also at the age of 39 in the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. So we must hold up the bloodstained banner for them, and Dr. Betty Shabazz, and Dr. Coretta Scott King, and Rosa Parks, whose statue is right down the hall here in Statuary Hall. We must do these things for them, standing on the shoulders of those ancestors. We must do it for those who are present, and we must do it for the yet unborn. God bless you all.
Blessings to you, Reverend Mark. We appreciate your words, and they're connecting the theological thought to the voting rights, the HR 40 bill, and also segueing into our discussion for our voting rights panel with Christian and Israel. Thank you so much to everybody else who is watching. It is, okay for you to go ahead and place your questions down in the Q&A. We are checking and monitoring it, because there will be a question and answer period at the end of this particular session, and we want to make certain that you fill up that question and answers chat, so that we are just not here talking heads. Okay, here we go. Christian and Israel, are you there? I believe I'm going to go to Christian first. So Christian, you're going to talk to us about the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And then Israel, I believe that you're going to have a conversation about the Freedom to Vote Act. So go ahead, have your way.
Thank you so much, Antonia. Keith, are you going to share this? Awesome. Here we go. So Keith, if you could actually go over to the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act so that I can touch on that really quickly. Keep going. Okay, here we go. So everyone, my name is Christian Brooks. I am the domestic policy representative for the Presbyterian Church USA. I will be going over the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement portion of the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, but I did want to touch on this really quickly because this is a new bill. So on January 13th, the House of Representatives passed the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, which is a combination of the critical provisions of the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And this is the bill that is currently being debated in the Senate right now. So earlier we heard Reverend Dr. Mark Thompson and Reverend Dr. Cassandra Gould talk about things that they heard on the Senate floor and debates going on. This is the bill that is being debated on. So if you could go back, Keith. Okay, over one more. Okay, here we go. So just to give a little background, further information on why it is extremely important that we get this bill passed. So the current Voting Rights Act that we have continues to be broken down. So on June 25th of 2013, so the Supreme Court basically nullified Section 5 of the current Voting Rights Act that we have. So Section 5 is the pre-clearance section that states that states that have been selected for pre-clearance have to go through the Department of Justice when they are trying to implement voting laws. Now, the Supreme Court did not vote Section 5 to be unconstitutional. It was actually Section 4B. So Section 4B is the formula that decides which states have to go through clearance. So basically, if it was a state that had a certain amount of complaints about voter discrimination, had a history of voter discrimination, then these states would have to go through pre-clearance, which is Section 5. However, when the formula was deemed to be outdated and therefore unconstitutional, well, now we have no formula to decide which states have to go through pre-clearance. So not only is Section 4 obsolete, that makes Section 5 obsolete as well. But then there was a further attack on the Voting Rights Act in July of 2021. So in July of 2021, there was a case that came up to the Supreme Court where there were two voting laws in Arizona that were thought to be discriminatory. And Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act basically gives voters the ability to sue when it comes to voting bills that are intentionally discriminatory or will yield discriminatory results. Well, because the Supreme Court narrowly applied Section 2, they deemed that the laws that were implemented in Arizona were not discriminatory. This then set a precedent moving forward, making it very difficult for people to bring cases against states for discriminatory voter laws. Next slide. Okay, so that is why we need the Voting Rights Advancement Act. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act will create a formula to determine which states and localities will be subject to pre-clearance. So it will basically update the formula that the Supreme Court previously said was out of date and therefore unconstitutional. But it will also strengthen protections and codify prior standards for Section 2 cases. So strengthen a person's ability to sue if a voting law is deemed to be discriminatory or might yield discriminatory results. But it also includes the Native American Voting Rights Act, which protects the right of Native Americans to vote. So there is a lot of voter discrimination against Indigenous and Native American folks, such as not accepting tribal IDs as a form of identification when going to vote, intentionally not locating polling stations in a close proximity to reservations or tribal lands, issues with mail-in voting, things of that sort. But it also includes protections for language minorities. Next slide. Okay, so more reason why we need this, right? So in the 2020 election, we had the highest voter turnout in over a century. About 66.7% of people turned out to vote. However, in 2021, states passed some of the highest numbers of voter suppression laws that we have seen in the past 10 years. 19 state legislators passed 34 laws restricting the right to vote. This included stricter voter ID laws, reducing poller placing locations and hours, increased voter polls, increased restriction on mail-in ballots. Two examples would be the Georgia SB 202 and Texas SB 1. So with Georgia SB 202, this is the bill that was very controversial and got a lot of attention, that prohibits anyone except poll workers from handing out water to voters in line and outlaws passing out food and water to voters within 150 feet of the building that serves as a polling location, inside the polling place, and within 25 feet of any voter standing in line. It also changed absentee voting. So for anyone who wants to vote early, the mail-in ballot can only be requested 11 weeks before the election instead of 180 days. Previously, it was 180 days, which is about 25 weeks before the election. But then for Texas SB 1, it bans 24-hour and drive-through voting and makes it more difficult for voters with disabilities or with language barriers to obtain assistance in voting. Additionally, in December of 2021, at least 13 bills in 4 states were pre-filed for 2022 that would make it harder for people to vote. So the right to vote is under attack, and we really, really need this legislation to pass. I am going to pass it over to Israel now, who will talk about the freedom to vote portion of the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act.
Thank you so much, Christian. So I am the legislative assistant at the Religious Action Center, and along with my portfolio, which covers reparations, it also covers voting rights. And I'm going to move us along into the second part to the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, which was originally the Freedom to Vote Act, which before that was the For the People Act. So just as an overview, we'll start with a little bit of background information, touching on what Christian's already mentioned, and then move us through some of the provisions outlined in the specific act, and give context as to where we stand today on this bill. Next slide. So just to kind of reiterate what Christian has already said, there are still, in addition to the 34 laws that have been passed, there are over 440 anti-voter laws that have been introduced in 49 of these states, which is why we're in a time of critical urgency when it comes to voting restrictions that discriminate disproportionately communities of color, specifically the Black community, and it is why federal protections are necessary. And in this image here, you see voter protections that differ by state. The dark green being states that have relatively strong protections, and the orange and red states being those that continue to marginalize the voices of its constituents. Next slide. So here's a quick overview of some of the top provisions outlined in the Freedom to Vote Act. which many of our coalition partners are happy to see that have been included in this bill. But let's take a little bit of a closer look at some of these provisions. Next slide. So as previously stated, the Freedom to Vote Act would create a baseline national standard for voting access, preempting many of the onerous restrictions that have been passed or proposed by states already. So this includes requiring all 50 states to offer early and mail-in voting, making Election Day a federal holiday, addressing challenges faced by Americans with disabilities, and expanding acceptable forms of voter identification. This would also allow the right to vote, and it clearly would allow the right to vote to be expanded for more than the small group or the sum of groups that are given that right today. Next slide. And in addition to these provisions, the Freedom to Vote Act further modernizes the voter registration system, which will solve a majority of registration problems that routinely keep millions of Americans from voting, which we've seen a lot of these past years. And this bill would do this by instating automatic same-day and online voter registration, preventing highly discriminatory acts of voter purging, which again highly target communities of color and Black individuals, where ballots are thrown out. And the practice has increased over the past year, again highlighting the moment of urgency. The Freedom to Vote Act also takes direct action to respond to the overt voter suppression that has been blocking Americans' access to the ballot box, which includes combating deceptive and intimidating practices at ballot locations, restoring the right to vote to formerly incarcerated individuals, and countering discriminatory practices as mentioned, like the long lines at polling places and the restrictions in getting water and food at these lines, which have seen to have the greatest negative impact on Black and Latino voters. And individuals will be provided the right to sue if their constitutional right is in fact infringed upon. Redistricting is also one of the key parts of voter legislation and why we are in a state of urgency as our democracy is under threat. The new redistricting cycle has already begun, and many states have released maps with highly partisan motivations and silencing the voices of Americans and giving control to particular parties. So here you see maps that have already been released from Texas and North Carolina, which can clearly show this partisan practice, but there still is time to prevent the continued worst extreme gerrymandering and discrimination against communities of color through the passage of this bill. But it is essential that it is passed quickly before maps are solidified and congressional redistricting continues to be extremely continues to be released on party lines. Next slide. And another key provision is in this bill references the control of money in politics and reforming our campaign finance system. So in 2022, the presidential election cycle topped $3.3 billion, which is a threefold increase from the previous election in outside spending, excuse me. And the problem continues to grow. In the 2020 elections, we also saw an expansive Senate race in the contest between Republican incumbent David Perdue and Democratic challenger Jon Ossoff. The candidates and outside groups combined spent over $510 million. In total, the 2020 election cycle cost over $14.4 billion, which shatters a previous record set in 2016 at $5.6 billion. So the Freedom to Vote Act would take crucial steps to end the control of this money in politics by ending dark money, addressing the significant role that PACs play in funding candidates who run for various positions, and creating the first voluntary small donor matching system, which would be paid for exclusively through a new state election assistance and innovation fund, which is not reliant on taxpayer dollars. Next slide. The Freedom to Vote Act also includes new specific protections to counter tactics that arose in 2021, from attacks on election officials to partisan election reviews. Ballot and record keeping will be standardized, and individuals will have the opportunity to bring a lawsuit again forward if their ballot was not counted or certified properly. And many of these provisions are of the utmost importance, and that is why we will transition into our call to action as to why it is significantly important to ensure that the provisions that are outlined in the Freedom to Vote Act, as well as the provisions in the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that have been combined into this new bill, are passed. So I am now going to pass it over to Mary Novak, the Executive Director of a Network, to highlight our call to action.
Thank you, Israel, and thank you, Christian, for this incredibly important information and background. So we need you to call your senators, and do we have that slide? Here we go. We need to call your representatives in support of HR 40, which is the legislation to get a commission for reparations. We need you to call your senators to get the Freedom to Vote John Lewis Act passed, which we've just heard is the combination of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021 and the Freedom to Vote Act. So call this number, and we're going to pause so that you can write it down. Call this number twice for each one of your senators and leave this important message about passing the Freedom to Vote, the John Lewis Act. Really critical today, as we heard from our prior speakers. Ask your senator to support changing the Senate rules first to pass legislation to protect the voting rights. And that's the filibuster that we heard about. And that's the first step to getting the Freedom to Vote John Lewis Act passed. Now, if you don't like to use the phone, some people don't, please email your senators and your representatives. We're going to pause here and let you write down where you would do that. Okay? Back to you, Antonia.
Thank you so very much, Mary, Christian, and Israel. So to the panel, I'm going to start with this question. Is there a way we can call or write the dissenting senators other than our senators?
So I can just respond with another specific call to action. It is really important that constituents of the states of West Virginia and Arizona make their voices heard to their own senators. Messages are recorded differently for constituents who make these messages heard through email and through calls than if people were to get these messages to them from other states. So I will highlight the importance in continuing to do this for people who are on the call and who have friends and family and anybody you know in Arizona and in West Virginia who can make their voices heard to their senators. And to respond to a message that you can communicate to your own senator, the Senate is currently at debate. So they really need our support and our words of affirmation that the debate on this bill is necessary. which means that it should happen for as long as possible in order to effectively show the importance for voting rights to be passed and ultimately get these bills through the finish line. Christian, I'm not sure if you have anything else to add.
I'm really glad that you brought up the support piece, because it is very important to contact your senator if your senator has supported the legislation. One, thanking them for supporting the legislation and encouraging them to honestly hold the line, and encouraging them to continue to fight to get this passed. But as Israel said, you can contact senators that are not necessarily your senator, but have not supported the legislation. However, they want to hear from people who are voting for them. They want to hear from their constituents. They're not going to weigh the words of someone who is not voting for them to stay in that office as much as they will someone who is. So like Israel said, if you know people who are in these states, such as West Virginia and Arizona, if you know people in those states, tell them to contact their senators and tell their senators to support this legislation. Honestly, if you are in other states, if you are in states where someone is a moderate Republican, tell them to support this legislation. We need every vote that we can in order to get this legislation passed.
Thank you both for that. I'm also going to go to the question and answer chat where it says to give an example of a voter ID law that is suppressive. Be more descriptive, or
I can give an example of that. So voter ID laws that are suppressive, so basically requiring a certain form of identification. So there are some states that will require you to have a state issued ID, whether it is a driver's license or a state issued ID that's not a driver's license, in order to vote. Here's the problem with that. If you live in a state where there is a reservation, the people who live on reservations, indigenous folks, Native Americans, they have reservation IDs or they have tribal IDs. So that ID is not being accepted. And then their addressing is very different from those of us who don't live on tribal lands or on reservations. So it's very difficult to get an ID. But then also, if you live in DC like me, your ID costs $50. There aren't a lot of people who have $50 to throw around to get an ID, right? So there are so many issues that come along with with restricting IDs. You have students who should be able to use their university ID, right? Because all of the documentation that you need to get an ID, you had to show when you went to school anyway. So why can't you use your university ID? So there are just so many injustices when it comes to voter IDs in terms of the cost, the level of access, all of that.
Thank you, Christian. And Deb Martin, I see you in the question and answer. Thank you for calling both of your Wisconsin senators and leaving a message. We appreciate your willingness to step up and walk in this call to action. And since there are no questions from our viewing and listening audience, I'm going to go ahead and swing it back to Mary. Thank you all very much for joining us. I am so excited to have had this opportunity to sit with you and have this reparatory justice conversation. Mary, don't you think this was an amazing time and space for us and an important time for us to gather around this particular topic?
Absolutely. It was a superb privilege for me to be here. And we would like to thank all of you for joining us today. And with a special thanks to Reverend Dr. Aundreia Alexander from the National Council of Churches, the Reverend Antonia Ruth Coleman from the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, Reverend Dr. Cassandra Gould from the Missouri Faith Voices, Reverend Dr. Mark Thompson, public theologian and activist, and host of the Make It Plain podcast, Christian Brooks from the Presbyterian Church USA, and Israel Harris from the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. These religious leaders have profoundly opened out for us the inextricable connection of reparative and reparative justice with participating in our democracy by way of the foundational right to vote. So as we close this sacred time together, let us pray. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who has brought us thus far along the way. The tale of two Americas is a present lived reality. We the people are suffering and will suffer further if our federally elected officials don't act now together for our common good. We faithful are gathered here today to lift up our hearts to you, and we are indeed righteous in our cause to call for some bodiness for all. Help us, O God, we need you to soften hearts, open ears and eyes that would hear and see for the sake of we the people and generations to come. Fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle within them, within us, the fire of your love. Enliven your creation to make justice happen, to be lovingly merciful, and to be humble. This we pray in your holy name. Amen. And now let us take our prayer into action by calling our senators to support voting rights, and remember to dial twice to reach each of them. And again, as our wisdom figures gathered here today have suggested, call your senator, even if they did the right vote, and thank them for doing that. The information is on the slide. It's also in the chat. Thank you very much.